November 2021. It was a Friday evening, and I was walking into the grand ballroom at the St. Regis in Atlanta, wearing a borrowed tie and shoes that pinched, when I heard her voice, the voice of the woman who was about to become my daughter-in-law, murmur to her mother with the kind of contempt you can't fake. The dirty hick finally showed up. I stopped dead in the middle of the corridor. The blood rose to the roots of my hair. My lungs felt like someone had reached in and squeezed out all the air. My first instinct, the instinct of a 63-year-old man, raised not to make a scene, was to turn around, walk back to the parking lot, get in my truck, and drive away without saying a single word to anyone. But before I could take even one step, Malcolm appeared out of nowhere. He grabbed my arm with a firmness that surprised me, pulled me close, and pressed his mouth to my ear. "Easy, Pop. Tomorrow we get our revenge." There was something in his voice I didn't recognize. A hardness, a certainty that wasn't anger. It was resolve. The kind of certainty a man carries when he's already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to act. I didn't understand anything in that moment. I only knew I needed to trust him, and I did. But before I tell you what happened, the next morning, the morning that changed the course of my family forever, you need to know who I am, where I come from, why those words cut the way they did, and why what we did in response to them was not just necessary but inevitable. My name is Elijah Davis. Everyone calls me Eli. I'm 63 years old. I was born and raised on a small farm outside Monroe County, Georgia. My daddy was a farmer before me, and that's what I ended up being too. I grew up working the soil. Corn, collard greens, sweet potatoes, soybeans. From a boy, I learned that honest work, however hard, is what builds a man's character. Not the diploma on the wall, not the last name, not the number in a bank account. The character. My hands carry calluses that tell decades of story, decades of soil and rain and sun that doesn't forgive, of good harvest and bad harvest, of nights working by lantern light when the power went out, of mornings rising before dawn to check on the cattle. These hands were the first tools I ever owned, and to this day, they're the ones I trust most. I didn't come from money, but I didn't go without either. My family always had enough. A decent house, food on the table, clean clothes, and more important than any of that, values. My daddy taught me that a man is worth what he does, not what he has. That dignity doesn't have a price. That respect is earned through action, not by the name on a mailbox. When I was 25, I married Sarah, the most beautiful and generous woman I've ever known in my life. Simple wedding at the town church, just our people, just real joy. No famous DJ, no fancy photographer, no imported dessert table. Just love and family and a celebration that went until the sun came up. We had 2 children, Malcolm and Naya. We raised our children with the same values I learned from my daddy. Hard work, honesty, humility, respect for everybody, regardless of where they came from or how much money they had in their pocket. Sarah was strict about that. In this house, everybody's welcome, but nobody's better than anybody else. Sarah passed 6 years ago from a heart condition we didn't catch in time. It was fast, it was painful, and it was devastating in a way I still don't have fully adequate words for. One day she was well, and the next she was in the hospital. And within the week I was standing at a graveside, holding the hands of my adult children, while the preacher said the final prayers. Life doesn't stop even when you want it to. I learned that the hard way. I was left with the children. Adults by then, thank God. And I learned to carry the grief in a way that didn't knock me over. It's not that the pain goes away. It's that you learn to live with it the way you learn to walk with a stone in your shoe. It's always there. You just stop tripping. Nia, my daughter, married 3 years ago to a good man, a high school teacher. They live in Atlanta and have a little girl who is the light of my life. They visit often. Nia never forgot where she came from. She still helps out on the farm when she can. Still makes the cornbread the way her mama taught her. I'm real proud of her. Malcolm, my older child, is 32 and an agricultural engineer. He studied at Tuskegee University on a full scholarship, the first in our family to get a college degree. The day he graduated was one of the happiest of my life, second only to my wedding day with Sarah. I sat in those bleachers wearing the suit I'd worn to her funeral, the only suit I own, and cried tears of pride without a single ounce of shame. Malcolm was always hardworking, intelligent, and respectful. For years, he worked advising farmers and agribusiness companies on cultivation techniques, efficient irrigation, and sustainability. He was doing well professionally. Not rich, but comfortable and dignified. And he never lost contact with me. Every week, he was at the farm, helping with whatever needed doing, and we'd sit on the porch with a beer, watching the Georgia sunset. That was how life was. Simple, but good. Honest. 18 months before that engagement dinner, Malcolm brought a woman home to meet me. Her name was Cassandra Sterling. Everybody called her Cassie. He brought her to a family Sunday dinner at the farm. She arrived polished and well-dressed, with that air of someone accustomed to fine things. Her family was from Greenwich, Connecticut. Her father, Wallace Sterling, was in the export business. Money people, I thought when I met her, but I held my judgment. My son was in love, and that was what mattered. But from the very beginning, from that first dinner, something about Cassie didn't sit right with me. She wasn't rude. She wasn't openly discourteous. She smiled, asked questions, complimented the food I'd prepared. But there was something in how she looked at me. An assessment. Like she was measuring my worth, checking my weight as a man, and finding the account in the red. She smiled, but her eyes didn't participate in the smile. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was my own paranoia, that I was being that difficult father no son deserves. When Malcolm told me they were getting married, I congratulated him with full heart and tears in my eyes. Son, if she makes you happy, I'm happy. And I meant that. But inside, there was a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen, no matter how hard I tried. Cassie's parents were Wallace Sterling, a man in his 60s, well-dressed, with that air of superiority that only old money seems to grant, and Deborah Sterling, an elegant woman with refined manners who smiled but had eyes as cold as river stone. The first time I visited their home, a massive estate in a gated community in Greenwich, I felt completely out of place. It was a large house with professionally maintained gardens, furniture that looked ripped from a catalogue, and a silence that wasn't peace. It was deliberate distance. The kind of house where every object is positioned just right, not to be enjoyed, but to be evaluated by whoever visits. Wallace greeted me with a limp, drawn-out handshake. "Good to meet you, Mr. Davis. Malcolm's told us so much about you." But his tone said the opposite. His tone said, I know exactly who you are, and I am not impressed. Deborah was worse. She offered me coffee in a china cup so thin I was afraid I'd snap it. Through the whole conversation, she asked me questions that sounded innocent but were clearly designed to confirm what she already thought of me. So, you've lived on the farm your whole life, Mr. Davis? Yes, Mom. My whole life. How interesting. And do you have any other enterprises besides farming? No, Mom. The farm is all I know. How noble, working with the land. There's something almost poetic about it, isn't there? Noble. The word landed like an insult wrapped in a compliment. Noble. As if I were a folk artifact to be appreciated from a safe distance rather than a human being with my own dignity. But I swallowed my pride for my son. He was happy, and I didn't want to be the father who destroys his son's happiness over feelings he couldn't prove. The months passed. Wedding preparations moved forward. I helped where I could. Malcolm told me not to worry about the costs. Cassie's family was covering nearly everything. They insisted, Pop. But I put in my share anyway, because he was my son and it was my obligation. I gave what I had saved. It wasn't much by their standards, but it was honest money earned by the sweat of decades of work. And then came the engagement dinner. 1 week before the wedding, a luxury hotel in Atlanta with more than 50 guests from both sides. Family, friends, Malcolm's colleagues, and me, the father of the groom, arriving straight from the farm after a long day's work. I'd showered, put on my best dress shirt and the slacks I kept for special occasions. I'd combed my hair carefully. I'd shined my boots until they reflected. But I was still just me, a 63-year-old man with calloused hands and old boots, in a hotel where the bottled water cost $8. When I walked into the ballroom, still looking for my son among the elegant crowd, I heard her voice. The dirty hick finally showed up. It wasn't shouted. It was a murmur to her mother, who was standing right beside her. But it was loud enough for me to hear, and loud enough for the people nearby to hear too. Some would look away afterward. Others would produce that polite discomfort people perform when they've become involuntary witnesses to something they'd have preferred not to see. I stopped. I felt the corridor tilt softly, like when your blood pressure drops sudden. I caught in the corners of my eyes some gazes turning toward me. Some pitying, others uncomfortable. A couple with that poorly disguised amusement that is itself an insult wearing neutrality's clothes. I turned to leave, to go away without ruining Malcolm's evening. But Malcolm appeared out of nowhere, grabbed my arm with firmness, and instead of letting go, pulled me close. Easy, Pop, he whispered in my ear. Tomorrow we get our revenge. I looked at him. What? Trust me. Just get through tonight. I'll explain everything later. There was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not anger. Anger, I knew. Anger passes. Anger is hot and imprecise. This was something else. This was the cold serenity of a man who has already made an irreversible decision and is simply waiting for the hour to execute it. I nodded. I didn't understand anything, but I trusted him. I always have. Malcolm led me to a table on the far side of the ballroom. He introduced me to some of his engineer colleagues and researcher friends, educated people who treated me with genuine respect, who asked about the farm with real interest, who wanted to know about the soil type, the irrigation setup, the crop rotation. I felt included, valued, present in that evening. But through the entire dinner, I couldn't stop glancing toward the head table where Cassie was sitting with her parents, laughing, toasting, commenting on something I couldn't hear from where I was. As if she hadn't insulted me 20 minutes before. And Wallace, every so often, would glance in my direction with that smile that didn't reach his eyes. The smile of a man examining something that's exactly where he expected it to be. I survived that night because my son needed me to survive it. I ate what was served. I talked with whoever spoke to me. I thanked people who thanked me. And I left before the last guests. But Malcolm asked me to come to his car before I went. We got in. He closed the doors. He looked at me with a seriousness that made my chest tight. "Pop, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out to the end without interrupting." "Go ahead, son." He opened his phone, pulled up an audio recording app, and showed me a list of files. More than 20. "What's this?" Recordings. Cassie's, her parents. Conversations they had when they thought I wasn't listening. My stomach turned. "Malcolm, what did you do?" "I started suspecting something about 3 weeks ago. Cassie started asking strange questions about the farm. Whether it was in your name, whether you had a will, how much it might be worth. At first I figured it was natural curiosity. She was entering the family, she wanted to know. But she kept pushing. She started suggesting that after we got married, you should put the farm in my name. To protect it, she said, so there wouldn't be legal complications as you got older. Son, wait. There's more. One night I was at her parents' house and I heard voices in Wallace's study. The door was cracked open. Cassie was talking with her parents about both of us, about the farm, about their plans. Malcolm pressed play on one of the files. Cassie's voice came through clear, without the sweetness she used around me. "Almost there, Mom. 2 weeks. After the wedding, I'll convince Malcolm to talk to his father. The old man's a fool. He'll sign anything his son asks him to." Deborah's voice answered, "And if he doesn't sign, we use Plan B. Malcolm already gave me access to his accounts. He has savings. Not much, but enough for a start. And once we're married, everything's community property. I can move it however I want." Wallace's voice cut in. "The farm's the important part. That land is right in the zone they're going to develop. The state approved the highway extension. In 2 years, that land will be worth 10 times what it is now. We need that farm." "I know, Dad. That's why I'm marrying him." "You think I enjoyed going to that little town, pretending I liked his hick farmer father? But it'll be worth it." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Malcolm caught it. He looked at me with eyes full of pain and a rage so contained it hurt more than if he'd shouted. "There are more recordings, Pop, worse ones, talking about how they plan to manipulate me, how they plan to get you off the farm, how they're going to split the money when they sell the land." I couldn't speak for a long moment. I could only feel everything I'd thought I knew, crumbling around me like a plaster wall in a hard rain. "That's why I asked you to hold it together tonight," Malcolm continued. "Because tomorrow at the wedding, I'm going to expose everything in front of everyone. I have the recordings. I have video too. I went back to their house with a hidden camera. I have proof of everything. Son, the wedding is tomorrow. There are 50 people invited. There's a venue, catering, music. I know. All paid for. But I am not marrying that woman. And I'm not going to let them walk away from this. I looked at him for a long time. I saw the boy I'd raised. The same one who learned to drive the tractor at 10. Who cried when a calf died because he'd made it his friend, who took the greyhound to Tuskegee with a beat-up duffel bag and more potential than he knew what to do with. And I saw the man he'd become, a man who wouldn't let himself be used, a man who wouldn't let his father be humiliated. You certain about this? Completely. It's going to be a hell of a scandal. Let it be. I'd rather the scandal than a lifetime tied to a lie. I pulled him into a hug, tight and long, the way I hugged him when he was a boy and had nightmares. I'm proud of you, son. Thanks, Pop, but I need your help. Tomorrow at the wedding, I need you to stay calm. Don't react, no matter what you see. Everything's going to happen according to plan. What plan? He smiled. It was Sarah's smile on his face. You'll see. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the hotel room, turning everything over in my mind. Cassie's words, the recordings, Wallace's cold smile at dinner, Deborah's voice saying the old man's a fool, and my farm, the land my daddy left me, the land I worked for 40 years, the land where Sarah and I raised our children, being negotiated behind my back like a commodity. That farm isn't just land. It's 3 generations of Davis family. It's my grandfather's sweat clearing that red Georgia clay. It's my father's work fencing and irrigating and building. It's 40 years of my own labor. It's where Sarah is buried, where her roots are, where my children's roots are. And they had planned to steal it. Cold, deliberate, methodical. In that hotel room at 2 in the morning, lying on a mattress that smelled of air conditioning and cleaning product, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let this happen without consequence. Not for me. I've been humiliated before in this life and survived it. But because people like the Sterlings don't stop on their own. If not us, it would be another family, another love-struck son, another trusting father who would sign anything his boy asked him to. This needed to end. Early the next morning, Malcolm called. Pop, can you come by my place? There's someone I want you to meet. I arrived an hour later. Malcolm was there with another man, a guy in his 40s, glasses, casual clothes, a laptop open on the table. Pop, this is Ty Jackson. He's an AV technician. He's going to help us with the presentation today. Ty shook my hand. Real pleasure, Mr. Davis. Malcolm explained the plan. They were going to set up a projection system in the ballroom, a large screen installed behind the altar. Minutes before the vows, the recordings and videos would be projected for everyone in the room, coordinated with surgical precision. The venue manager already thinks it's a surprise slideshow from the groom for the bride, Malcolm said. I paid him extra. He has no idea what's actually in it. And Cassie has no idea. She texted me this morning, excited, saying she can't wait to become my wife. The contempt in my son's voice as he said that was something I could feel physically. Ty showed me how everything would work. The edited recordings with subtitles. The videos time-stamped so nobody could question their authenticity. The exact timing of the presentation. Every detail thought through, every contingency accounted for. It's going to drop like a bomb, Ty said, but a well-placed one. I left that apartment with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that kept my fingers cold. This was going to change everything. For Malcolm, for me, for both families. for every one of the 50 people who would walk into that ballroom thinking they were going to a beautiful wedding. Sometimes truth isn't gentle in how it arrives, but it arrives all the same. The wedding day came. I put on my one suit, the same one I wore to Nia's wedding, the same one I wore to Sarah's funeral. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought of her, what she'd say if she were here. I'm certain she'd be proud of Malcolm, the courage he showed, the courage to refuse to be used, to refuse silence out of shame or convenience, was exactly the kind of courage Sarah always wanted our children to have. I arrived at the ballroom 2 hours before the ceremony. Ty was already there, setting up the projection system with a discreet assistant. The venue staff thought it was part of the romantic decor. A big screen for couple photos after the ceremony, as Malcolm had communicated. Nobody suspected a thing. I went and sat in the first pew on the groom's side alone. The place where Sarah should have been was empty. But I felt her presence. That thing that fathers who've lost the mother of their children understand without needing it explained. Like she was there invisibly, telling me, "Hold steady, Eli. The truth always comes out." The guests began arriving. Cassie's family. Elegant, loud with that particular confidence that comes from having always assumed the room belongs to you. Friends from both sides. Malcolm's colleagues. People who had absolutely no idea what they were about to witness. And then the ceremony began. The traditional wedding march filled the ballroom. The guests rose. The doors at the back opened, and Cassie appeared on Wallace's arm. She wore a spectacular white gown. Must have cost a fortune. With jewelry that caught every light at every step. Her veil covered her face, but through the tulle you could see the satisfied smile. The smile of someone arriving at the finish line of a plan. Wallace walked with his chest out like a king delivering a princess. Malcolm stood at the altar, immaculate in a black suit. But I know my son. I know every gesture, every micro-expression, every point of tension. To the guests, he looked like a nervous groom waiting for his bride. To me, I could see the rigidity in his shoulders, the set of his jaw, his hands slightly closed at his sides, the body of a man holding something heavy until the right moment to release it. Cassie arrived at the altar. Wallace handed her off to Malcolm with a pat on the shoulder, a gesture that seemed to say, "She's your problem now, son." Then he went to sit beside Deborah, who shot me a brief look of superiority before turning to smile toward the altar like a proud mother. The minister began. The traditional words, the welcome, the reflection on marriage, the responsibilities, the commitment for life. Everything sounded beautiful. Everything looked perfect. I glanced discreetly toward the back of the room. Ty was in the technical control booth, waiting. The large screen installed behind the altar was dark, neutral, innocent. Guests certainly assumed it was for couple photos later. They didn't know it was a guillotine waiting for its moment. The minister reached the readings. A cousin of Cassie's came up to read a passage about true love. A friend of Malcolm's read another. Very moving. Some people already had tissues out. Deborah cried delicately without ruining her makeup. Wallace maintained his proud smile. The father of the bride watching the plan come together. Then came the vows. The minister turned to Malcolm. "Malcolm Davis, do you take Cassandra Sterling to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part. Malcolm took a deep breath. He looked at Cassie. Then he looked at the minister. And he said something nobody expected. Minister, before I answer, there's something everyone present needs to see. The minister blinked. I beg your pardon. Information that needs to be shared before we continue with this ceremony. Cassie looked at him with an alarm she tried to conceal. Malcolm, what are you doing? The truth, my son answered, with a voice as steady and calm as I had never heard from him before. The voice of a man who has nothing to hide because he never had anything to hide. Then he gave a small nod toward the back of the room. The screen lit up. Murmurs rippled through the ballroom instantly. People turned toward the screen, confused, curious. And then the playback started. First, a title appeared in large white letters on a dark background. The truth about Cassandra Sterling and her family. Wallace was on his feet in an instant. What in the hell is this? Turn that thing off right now! But it was too late. The first video began. It was the Sterling living room. The same room where I drank coffee from a paper-thin china cup and answered questions about my work like a man being interviewed for a job he never applied for. The image quality was good. The audio was crystal clear. And what they were saying was devastating. Cassie's voice boomed through the ballroom speakers. Almost there, Mom. 2 weeks. After the wedding, I'll convince Malcolm to talk to his father. The old man's a fool. He'll sign anything his son asks him to. A collective gasp swept the room. Heads swiveled to the screen, then to Cassie, then to me. I stayed motionless, exactly as Malcolm had asked. Inside, I felt a mixture of rage, of pain, and of a bitter relief. The relief of someone realizing they weren't crazy, that the knot in their stomach they'd been trying to dismiss for months had been right all along. The recording continued. Deborah's voice. And if he doesn't sign, we use Plan B. Malcolm already gave me access to his accounts. He has savings. Not much, but enough. And once we're married, everything's community property. I can move it however I want. Cassie at the altar was white as her dress. No, that's been edited. That's a lie. But the video continued. Wallace now. The farm's the important part. That land is right in the zone they're going to develop. The state approved the highway extension. In 2 years, that land's going to be worth 10 times at what it is now. We need that farm. I know, Dad. That's why I'm marrying him. You think I enjoyed going to that little town, pretending I liked his hick farmer father? But it'll be worth it. The silence that followed was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They only stared at the screen in shock. Then the second video began. More recent, from the week before. Cassie on the phone. This nightmare is almost over. In a week I marry this idiot, and we start working on getting the farm from the old man. My dad's already got buyers lined up. We're going to make a fortune. One of Malcolm's friends stood up from his seat. This is unbelievable. It's a lie! Cassie screamed, tears streaming down her face. Malcolm, tell them it's a lie! Someone manipulated those videos! And then the third video appeared. It was from the previous day, the night of the engagement dinner. Cassie and her mother in the hotel restroom, touching up their makeup. Deborah was saying, "Did you see how the father showed up? That whole presentation. My God." Cassie laughed. "I know. The dirty hick finally showed up. But relax, Mom. After the wedding, we'll make sure Malcolm creates some distance from him. We can put him in a cheap nursing home somewhere. We don't need him around. That was the last straw. Several guests rose to their feet in outrage. An aunt of Malcolm's called out from her pew. Malcolm's friends moved toward him at the altar, surrounding him in a gesture of protection and solidarity. On Cassie's side, guests were already filing toward the exits. Wallace tried to push through to the technical booth at the back of the room to kill the projection. But Ty had locked the door from the inside and slipped out through another exit. Wallace was left pounding on it, useless, while the presentation continued. And then it went further. Documents appeared on the screen. Contracts Wallace had prepared to sell my farm. Contracts bearing my forged signature. Agreements with real estate developers. Profit projections detailed and precise. Everything planned. Everything based on acquiring my land through Malcolm. And one line was enlarged on the screen. The amount a development company had already deposited as earnest money for the purchase. $200,000. Already paid. Already received. Before the wedding had even happened. The minister, completely overwhelmed, stepped down from the altar. I cannot continue with this. This isn't a ceremony. Cassie turned on Malcolm with the fury of someone caught doing what they'd planned to do their whole life. You destroyed me. You destroyed everything. No, my son responded with a calm that raised the hair on my arms. You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone knew who you really are. The chaos that followed was absolute. Wallace, after realizing the booth was locked, walked back trying to maintain some dignity. The dignity had already left, though, around the same time the screen lit up. Deborah was hysterical. This is defamation. We'll sue. You'll pay for this. And then something happened that nobody, not me, not Malcolm, had foreseen. A man rose from a seat on the guest's side. He was in his 50s, well-dressed, with an expression that suggested he didn't have much patience for pretense. Mr. Sterling, he said, loudly and absolutely clearly. I believe you and I need to have a conversation. I am Attorney Marcus Wells, a prosecutor with the District Attorney's Office of Fulton County. What I have just witnessed constitutes evidence of attempted fraud, conspiracy to deprive someone of their property, and what appears to be document forgery. I'm going to need you, your wife, and your daughter to accompany me. Wallace's jaw came unhinged. I looked at Malcolm. He looked back at me, every bit as surprised as I was. Attorney Wells was a guest from Cassie's side. Probably a family acquaintance. He hadn't been part of anyone's plan. We're not going anywhere, Deborah shrieked. Then I'll need to contact the police to escort you, Attorney Wells replied with the placidity of someone who's been through versions of this scene before and knows precisely what happens next. The ballroom was in full chaos. Some guests were filming on their phones. Others were heading for the exits. Malcolm's friends had formed a circle around us like a protective perimeter. Cassie tried to flee. She hiked up that spectacular wedding dress and moved fast toward the side exit. But some guests simply stepped in front of her. No violence, just bodies in the way. You're going to stay and answer for what you did, one of Malcolm's friends said quietly. Cassie collapsed. Right there on the ballroom floor in embroidered wedding dress and gleaming jewelry, crying in the way that comes when the performance you've been giving your whole life runs out of script. The perfect makeup ran in dark streaks. The veil twisted sideways. The golden dream had become something else entirely. Deborah tried to comfort her, but was crying herself. Not from remorse, I thought, but from the particular rage of someone who planned everything carefully and watched it unravel. Wallace sat in a chair with his head in his hands. The weight of decades of carefully constructed schemes collapsing in 40 minutes. 15 minutes later, the police arrived. 3 patrol cars. Uniformed officers moved through the ballroom with the professional calm of people who handle complicated situations as their daily work. Attorney Wells explained everything, showed some of the videos he'd filmed from the screen with his own phone. I need these 3 individuals to come with us to the station. A formal investigation is being opened. Wallace tried his last card of wounded dignity. This is absurd. We haven't done anything illegal. Conspiring to defraud someone of their property is illegal, Mr. Sterling. Forging documents is illegal. And what was presented in this room strongly suggests that both occurred. The investigation will determine the extent. They took all 3 of them. Cassie still in her wedding dress. Deborah crying. Wallace trying to hold himself together without success. When they were gone, the ballroom settled into a strange, suspended quiet. The minister had left a while back, visibly shaken. The venue staff didn't know what to do. The food was prepared. The music was ready, but there was no wedding. Malcolm stepped down from the altar and walked toward me. He put his arms around me. Tight. The way he used to hug when he was a boy. I'm sorry, Pop. Sorry for everything you had to hear last night and today. Don't you apologize for a single thing, son. You did what was right. The right thing sometimes hurts, but it's still the right thing. That night, when the celebration that had replaced the wedding celebration finally ended, because Malcolm insisted that the true friends stay, that the food wasn't going to waste, that there was reason to celebrate even if it was a strange one. Malcolm and I were left alone in the nearly empty ballroom. We sat in 2 chairs in the middle of the messy tables, glasses of water in front of us, and the particular silence of a space that has been through something large. Son, tell me everything. From the real beginning. Malcolm took a deep breath. About a month ago, Cassie started behaving differently. More interested in the farm, asking how many acres you owned, whether you had debts, about the will. At first I figured it was natural. She was entering the family. She wanted to know about what she was coming into. But she kept getting more insistent in a way that stopped feeling like curiosity. It started feeling like strategy. And what did you do? At a certain point I told her the farm was your decision, not mine. She got mad, said you were stubborn, that you didn't understand the modern world. And that's when I started paying different attention. Started noticing other things. Conversations she'd end when I walked into a room. Calls she said were work that clearly weren't. The way her parents looked at me. And the recordings? One evening I went to dinner at their house and arrived earlier than expected. I knocked, nobody answered, but I could hear voices. The door was unlocked. I went in and heard Cassie talking with her parents in Wallace's study. About us, about the farm, about their plans. And you recorded it right then? No. I froze and just listened. But afterward, I went back with a small recorder and a hidden camera. 3 weeks of collecting evidence. Recordings, videos, documents Wallace left sitting on top of his desk, including the contracts with your forged signature that he'd prepared himself. You took an enormous risk. I had to, because every day that passed, Cassie pushed harder. She'd already asked me for the passwords to my bank accounts, to organize the wedding finances, she said. And I, like a fool, gave them to her. You trusted the wrong person. We sat in silence for a time. Around us, the venue staff was quietly clearing things away. And now what happens? Practically speaking, the legal part. Attorney Wells contacted me before I even left the ballroom. He wants me to formally present all the recordings. They are going to investigate the Sterlings for attempted fraud and possibly more charges if they find additional irregularities. You think they'll find more? People like that don't operate clean, Pop. If they tried it with us, they've done it with others. I was right, and the days that followed would prove it exactly. The days after the cancelled wedding were a whirlwind of emotions, phone calls, and legal procedures I never imagined I'd be facing at 63. Malcolm and I met with Attorney Wells at his office at the District Attorney's building in Atlanta, a functional building without pretension. But his office was organized and serious, with diplomas on the walls representing years of experience in cases that weren't simple. He reviewed every file with meticulous care. He listened to the complete recordings, read every document, asked precise questions. After nearly 2 hours, he took off his glasses and looked at us directly. This is solid, very solid. We have clear evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. Cassie and her parents openly discussed plans to deprive Mr. Davis of his property through deception and manipulation. The documents Wallace prepared to sell the farm without being the owner constitute forgery, and the question of access to Malcolm's accounts can be framed as trust abuse with fraudulent intent. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. That we're opening formal charges against all three. The charges include attempted fraud, conspiracy, document forgery, and trust abuse. Depending on what the investigation reveals, additional charges may be added. But there was another matter. The Sterlings had already retained expensive attorneys from New York and had filed a counter-complaint alleging defamation and privacy violation for the recordings. Can they do that? I asked, alarmed. They can try, but their case is weak. The recordings were made in spaces where Malcolm had a legitimate right to be as a guest. They weren't obtained through illegal eavesdropping. And the content is so incriminating that any reasonable judge will understand that Malcolm was protecting himself and his father from imminent fraud. The investigation of the Sterlings had already turned up something beyond our case. Wallace Sterling has a history, not convictions, but civil lawsuits. In the last 10 years, he's been sued 5 times by business partners and associates, alleging fraud or breach of contract. 3 cases were settled out of court where he paid considerable sums. The other 2 were dismissed for lack of sufficient evidence. My stomach turned. And that doesn't show up in public records. It does if you know where to look. But most people don't look that deep. And Mr. Sterling is skilled at projecting an image of success and respectability. He lives in an exclusive community, has social connections, gives to charities, all designed to look legitimate. And Cassie? Malcolm asked, his voice tight. 3 years ago, she was briefly engaged to another man, a businessman from Atlanta. The engagement broke off abruptly. We spoke with him discreetly. He told us that Cassie's family started asking invasive questions about his properties and business operations. When he declined to give access to certain financial information, Cassie ended the relationship. Malcolm closed his eyes. It was their pattern. Exactly. And they would almost certainly have continued with others if you hadn't exposed them. 2 months after the preliminary hearing, where the judge set bail at $1 million per defendant and let the case proceed to trial, there was an unexpected development. One morning, while Malcolm and I were having coffee on the farm porch, an unfamiliar car appeared on the gravel drive. A gleaming black BMW, entirely out of place on our country lane. A man in his mid-40s, well-dressed, got out with a briefcase. "Mr. Elijah Davis?" "That's me. Who's asking?" "I'm attorney Leonard Stone. I represent the Sterling family." Malcolm was on his feet immediately. "You have nothing to say to us." "Please, just 5 minutes. I come with a proposal." I looked at Malcolm. He was shaking his head. But my curiosity, and maybe my need to look into the eyes of someone who serves people like the Sterlings, spoke louder. 5 minutes. Attorney Stone sat in a lawn chair I offered, his briefcase open across his lap. "My clients want to resolve this amicably. They're prepared to pay a generous settlement if you drop the charges. The judicial process is going to be long, expensive, and painful for everyone involved. A public trial will destroy reputations on both sides." "We have nothing to hide," I said firmly. "Perhaps not. But a jury trial is unpredictable. The Sterlings have resources to retain experts who can challenge the authenticity of the recordings. They can allege Malcolm manipulated them for revenge. They can complicate everything considerably." "The recordings are real," Malcolm said, his voice hard as creek stone. "I believe you. But a jury may have doubt if presented with sufficient technical counter-evidence. My job is to offer you a clean exit. $250,000 plus a public apology from the Sterling family, and everyone moves forward with their lives. $250,000. I could modernize the entire farm operation, help Malcolm rebuild his life, buy equipment I hadn't been able to afford in years. But I looked at my son, saw the pain he was still carrying, saw the betrayal still fresh in his eyes. And I looked at Attorney Stone's hands. Hands that had never plowed a furrow, never planted a seed, never harvested anything except fees for defending people who harm working folk. "No." "Mr. Davis, be reasonable." "No. What they did isn't settled with money. They tried to steal my land. They manipulated my son. They humiliated me. And they would have kept doing the same thing to other families. This goes to trial." Attorney Stone closed his briefcase with the resignation of a man who knows there's nothing more to accomplish here. "It's your decision, but the Sterlings will fight with everything they have." "Let them," Malcolm said. "We're ready." The car disappeared down the gravel lane in a cloud of dust. We stood watching it go. "Did we do right?" Malcolm asked. "We did right, son." And as I said those words, the Georgia wind moved through the pines at the field's edge, and I felt something I'd learned to recognize over 6 years of mornings on this porch without Sarah. The sense of her near, approving. The trial began on a February morning. The courtroom was full. There was press coverage. We had the truth on our side. And we'd also discovered we weren't alone. In the weeks between the preliminary hearing and the trial, other people had come forward to the prosecutor's office with similar stories. A woman named Candace White, briefly engaged to a cousin of Cassie's, who had gone through the same pattern of invasive questions about family assets and threats when she ended the relationship. A man named Robert Henderson, who had lost a family business after a partnership with Wallace. An older woman, Miss Ethel Johnson, whose son had been engaged to a niece of Cassie's. Each story a reflection of what had happened to us. Each testimony adding another layer to the pattern. The Sterlings entered escorted by their legal team. Cassie wore a conservative pantsuit, glasses she clearly didn't need, to look more serious, and a practiced expression of victimhood. Wallace maintained his air of wounded dignity. Deborah wore black, as if in mourning for the destroyed reputation. The trial lasted 2 full weeks. 2 weeks of testimony, evidence, and argument. The prosecutor was meticulous. The recordings presented and certified by forensic audio experts. The documents analyzed by forgery specialists who demonstrated the falsifications. The bank records tracing the earnest money from the developer to Wallace's account. The testimony of multiple victims. The defense tried everything. Argued the recordings were inadmissible. Denied. Argued the documents had been manipulated by Malcolm. The experts showed they hadn't. Tried to paint Malcolm as a resentful engineer who fabricated everything for a revenge. But Malcolm testified with a clarity and consistency that left the defense theory without foundation. When I took the witness stand, I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me many things, but the question that stayed with me was this one. Mr. Davis, when you heard Cassandra Sterling refer to you as the Dirty Hick, how did you feel? I breathed before answering. Ashamed, I admitted. Humiliated, but more than anything, hurt. Because I realized that the woman who was about to become my daughter-in-law despised me, and that my son was about to tie himself for life to someone who hated me without knowing me, just because I work the land and don't wear a tie. Did you ever authorize the sale of your farm? Never. That farm has been in my family for 3 generations. It's my grandfather's work, my father's work, my own work. It's where I raised my children. It's where my wife is buried. I would never sell it, and certainly not behind everyone's back. Did you ever sign the documents where you apparently authorized the sale? Never. Those signatures are forgeries. I never saw those papers before I saw them projected on that screen at the wedding. When they finally let me step down, I was exhausted, but I knew I'd held steady. At the end of the 2 weeks, when the judge announced he'd deliberate and deliver a verdict in 7 days, we left the courthouse, knowing we'd done everything within our power. Now, it was for justice to do its part. Those 7 days were the longest of my life. Malcolm and I worked the farm in near silence, each with our own thoughts. We fixed fences. We planted a new section of soybeans. We did the ordinary work because the ordinary work doesn't wait. And then the day came. The courtroom was full again. The Sterlings already looked defeated before it began. The judge entered. We rose. He sat and began to read. In the matter of the state versus Wallace Sterling, Deborah Sterling, and Cassandra Sterling, this court has reviewed all evidence presented. A pause that lasted an eternity. The recordings, authenticated by forensic specialists, demonstrate unequivocally an intent to commit fraud. The forged documents, verified by handwriting experts, constitute the crime of forgery. The testimony of multiple victims establishes a consistent pattern of criminal conduct. Another pause. This court finds Wallace Sterling guilty of all charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, document forgery, trust abuse, making criminal threats, and tax evasion. The sentence is 12 years in federal prison. Wallace sank into his chair like someone had drawn all the air out of him. Deborah Sterling is found guilty of complicity in fraud and tax evasion. The sentence is 8 years. Deborah sobbed audibly. Cassandra Sterling is found guilty of fraud, trust abuse, and complicity in forgery. The sentence is 10 years. Cassie didn't react. She stared at the middle distance, that particular vacancy that only exists when the life you constructed out of performance has nothing left to perform. Additionally, the court orders payment of damages to the victims and orders investigation of all defendants' assets and accounts to determine the full extent of fraudulent activities. The gavel came down. The room came alive with sound. We had won. Malcolm held me. Nia came from the back of the courtroom running, her eyes red. Malcolm's friends surrounded us. Attorney Wells shook our hands with a satisfied but unsentimental smile. The smile of a man who did his job and watched it work. We walked out of the courthouse into bright Atlanta February sunshine. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. The weight had been lifted. "How are you, Pop?" "Tired," I admitted, "but at peace." That night, back at the farm, Naya and her husband, Malcolm, and I had dinner together. We toasted. We told stories. We laughed in a way we hadn't laughed in a long time. It was the first genuinely joyful meal we'd had since this all began. When everyone went to bed, I sat on the porch alone, looking at the Georgia stars, which are something to see when you're away from city light. And I talked to Sarah, the way I sometimes do. We did it, sweetheart. We protected our boy. We protected the farm. We protected everything we built together. The wind moved through the pines. I chose to believe it was her telling me she was proud. The years that followed were quiet and good. Malcolm stayed at the farm as he'd promised. We modernized the operation together, implementing the sustainable techniques he'd studied at Tuskegee. The farm prospered more than it ever had. Malcolm eventually met someone else, a schoolteacher who taught at the rural elementary school 3 counties over. No pretense whatsoever, who loved him for exactly who he was. They married in a small ceremony right there on the farm, with family and the friends who'd stood by him. This time, every word said at that ceremony was honest. The Sterlings served their sentences. Wallace died in prison of cardiac complications, the kind of outcome you don't wish on anyone, but which doesn't surprise you when someone has spent a lifetime building things on rotten foundations. Deborah was released after 6 years for good behavior, older and broken, and returned to Connecticut to her sister. Cassie served her sentence in full. When she got out, she moved to another state. We never heard from her again. Candace White, Robert Henderson, and Miss Ethel Johnson also found justice through the process. Candace became a close family friend, comes to the farm for holiday dinners, doesn't see herself as a victim anymore. She's a strong, clear-eyed woman who uses what she went through to help others. Today, at 69, I look back and I see that nightmare made us stronger. Not in the way people say it when the problem is past, and it's easy to make things sound poetic. Actually stronger. With a clear understanding of what endures and what doesn't. What's real and what's performance. There are things about this story I left out, and they deserve to be said. Let me tell you about the months before it all came out. About the period between the day Malcolm introduced Cassie to me and the day I heard those words in the hotel corridor. 18 months. 18 months of looking at something I couldn't name, couldn't prove, and kept trying to convince myself wasn't there. It's hard to explain that experience to someone who hasn't lived it. You see an adult son, happy, genuinely happy, shining in a way you haven't seen him in years, and you have a knot in your stomach that won't loosen. And you know that if you speak, you'll seem jealous, controlling, that difficult father no son deserves. So you stay quiet, and the knot stays. Malcolm came to the farm every weekend as always. But from a certain point on, Cassie started coming along sometimes. And I learned to play the happy host, prepare the barbecue, ask about her work, laugh when she laughed. Do all the things a father does when he wants his son to be happy and knows the son needs him to accept the choice. But I lay awake at night, lay there thinking about small things she said, comments that seemed innocent but left a strange residue. Once, at a family lunch when Naya had come with the baby, Cassie mentioned in passing, like making conversation, that the land values around our county had increased considerably with road infrastructure projects. Anyone who had land out this way 20 years ago is sitting pretty now, she said, with that smile. It was a comment that could be entirely innocent, but I saw her eyes find me after she said it, as if she were checking my reaction. Another time, in a conversation with Malcolm about the farm's future, about who would take over when I couldn't anymore, she inserted herself with that studied naturalness I'd learned to recognize. But Malcolm's going to need to be on the property documents eventually, isn't he? To make things easier when decisions need to be made. Malcolm nodded along, giving it no particular weight, the way he does with most things she says. I did the same on the outside. On the inside, the knot tightened a notch. These are things you can't grab. Nothing you can show someone and say, look, there's something wrong here. Just the accumulation. Just the pattern forming underneath the everyday conversation like mold behind plaster. You don't see it, but you can smell something's off. And somewhere inside, I knew that if I went to Malcolm, he'd say, Pop, you're reading too much into this. And he'd probably be right to say it, because at that point, I had nothing except sensation. So I stayed quiet. And I learned that staying quiet when you know something costs you. That the silence of a man who feels something but can't prove it yet is a heavy silence to carry. There is one afternoon that stays with me with a clarity other memories don't have. It was a Saturday, about 3 months before the engagement dinner. Malcolm had come to the farm alone, without Cassie, who was at an event up north, and we spent the whole day working together the way we had in the old days. Fixed the fence on the back pasture, did some maintenance on the irrigation system, moved the cattle to the new rotation field. In the late afternoon, when the heat of the day was going with the light, we sat on the porch. Me with my water jug, him with a beer, and we talked for hours. About the farm, about projects I had planned, about his work, about where agriculture in Georgia was headed. One of those long, unhurried conversations that only happen when people have time and know we're urgent to be. And in a pause, while we were both watching the sky go orange at the tree line, Malcolm said, Pop, are you happy? The simplicity of the question caught me off guard. I am, son. More or less. The missing of your mama never goes away all the way, but I am all right. That's not what I asked. I asked if you're happy. I looked at him. There was something in the question that wasn't just a question. There was an opening, like he was giving me space to say something. And for a second, just a second, I thought about talking. Thought about saying, "Son, there's something I can't stop feeling." But I looked at his eyes, which still had that glow of a man in love, and I held it. "I'm fine, son. Real good." He nodded. We were quiet again. When I think about that moment now, I wonder what would have happened if I'd spoken. Whether he would have heard me. Whether it would have made any difference. But there's no way to know. Life doesn't give you a second chance at the silence you chose. What I know is that in that moment, Malcolm was also seeing something. I don't know whether he already had the suspicion formed or whether it was the same kind of discomfort I was carrying. But there was something in that question that wasn't casual, and neither of us spoke. Before I close, there are a few people in this story who deserve their own words. Robert Henderson, 53 years old when he came to the prosecutor's office, owner of a small agricultural supply distribution company in Middle Georgia. The kind of business you build over 20 years of long days and short weekends. He'd started with a leased warehouse and a truck bought on credit. A decade before our case surfaced, Robert had met Wallace Sterling at an agribusiness trade show in Atlanta. Wallace had presented himself as an export consultant with contacts in the American and European markets. Exactly what Robert needed to expand. 2-3 months of meetings, impressive slideshows, with numbers that seemed solid. Robert signed, entered a partnership that looked like the leap he'd been working toward his whole life. Within 6 months, Wallace had structured the relationship so that operational control of the distribution company had gradually migrated to a holding company he controlled. Not all at once, piece by piece, through technical justifications that each made sense individually, but together formed a pattern of hollowing out. By the time Robert understood what had happened, he had lost controlling interest. The process to recover it lasted years and was closed by settlement. Wallace paid a fraction of what he had taken. Robert absorbed the loss, and an attorney told him it was the best he was going to get. "I lost 20 years of work in 6 months," Robert told us, in a voice that wasn't angry anymore, just exhausted. "I agreed to the settlement because I was so tired that anything that ended it was better than another year of proceedings. I didn't know he was still doing this to other people." When he heard that our case had gone to trial and that other victims were going to testify, Robert slept his first full night in 10 years. He told us, "That is what I think about when anyone asks whether it was worth refusing the $250,000 settlement. It was worth it, obviously worth it." Ms. Ethel Johnson also deserves more than a passing mention. 71 years old at the time of the trial, retired school librarian from Decatur, widowed 15 years. Her son had dated a niece of Cassie's for about a year, a young woman from up north who had arrived in her son's life the way these things do, by the ordinary roads that lead people to each other. After a few months, the young woman's family had begun asking questions about the house Miss Johnson owned outright, inherited from her late husband, about a small piece of property they had in the country, about finances. her son had noticed and ended the relationship? Immediately, the girl's family had retained attorneys and threatened to sue for emotional damage from the abrupt ending of the relationship. Ms. Johnson had paid her own attorney out of pocket to defend her son. The case went nowhere. It was obviously without merit, but it cost time, money, and an anxiety she described in her testimony as the hardest thing I've been through since I lost my husband. I didn't come here for myself, she said from the witness stand, with the clear voice of a woman who is 71 years old and has learned not to be afraid of saying what she means. I came because my son is going to get married one day, and if these people had been left alone, it could have happened to whoever he marries, to somebody's daughter, to any family. The courtroom was silent when she finished. And say to whoever is listening to this story, if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Trust your instinct, not in the impulsive way, but in the way Malcolm trusted his. Paying attention, collecting evidence, acting at the right time. Protect what is yours, not just the land, not just the money. Protect the roots. Protect the values. Protect what the generations before you pass down, because that cannot be bought back once it's lost. And never ever be afraid to stand up for the truth, because in the end, the truth always prevails. It may take time, it may hurt, it may cause scandal, but it prevails. Genuine love, true respect, and honest dignity are worth more than all the money in the world. I'm glad to have been able to share my story with you. If it moved you in some way, if you recognized something in it, if it made you think about what's worth protecting in your own life, show me by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. Until the next story. Script Registry, Girdina N, ABO7, ENZO4, CFLO1, TE3, RVO4, DSO4, Artizoid, PN2, DBs1, MDs02, PCs01, CISO6, DE7, D1, C1, TT2, NA1, EBO4, RIMS1, RO4, CVT2, TC1, EK3. Sensory Anchor, Georgia Wind Through the Pines Plus. The empty place on the pew where Sarah should have been. Semantic field, soil, roots, inheritance, harvest, calluses, legacy, sweat, generation. But there are things I left out of this story that belong here, because telling just the skeleton of facts is giving the result without what produced it. And what produced this result was long, painful, and full of moments that don't fit any shortened version. Let me tell you about what the legal process actually cost. Not in money. That expense was manageable, especially because Attorney Wells was relentless and fair. I mean the human cost. What it cost to face a process that will stretch for months, that will expose you publicly, that will require you to sit in front of lawyers paid to make you look dishonest or manipulative before a judge. I mean, waking at 3 in the morning before a court date, unable to sleep again. Reading through testimony after testimony, trying to find anything you said wrong. Any gap the other side's lawyers could use. Watching your son sit through a 2-hour cross-examination, where a lawyer in an expensive suit does everything in his power to suggest that Malcolm fabricated all of it, from recordings to videos, as a revenge plot against a woman who rejected him. Malcolm never wavered, not once in those 2 hours. He answered every question precisely, consistently, without raising his voice or giving the defense any emotional footage to work with. I watched him from my seat and thought, Sarah, you should see your boy right now. There was one afternoon specifically, after a particularly brutal session, when we drove back to the farm and Malcolm went straight to bed without eating. I sat alone in the kitchen with the stew I'd left cooking, eating in silence and asking myself whether we'd been right to refuse the settlement. $250,000. End the process. End the exposure. We could have done that. But then I thought about Candace White, about Robert Henderson, about Miss Ethel Johnson, about all those people who hadn't had the evidence Malcolm had, who'd been threatened into silence, who had stayed silent. And I thought, if we take that money the Sterlings walk and they do it again. Different family, same method. I rinsed my bowl, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. And the next morning, we went back to the courthouse. There's something about how Wallace Sterling became the man he was that I spent time thinking about after the trial, because understanding it doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses planning to steal 3 generations of a family's labor from them. But understanding it helps explain why there was a pattern, why it wasn't just us. Wallace had grown up in a modest family in New Jersey. His father was a factory worker, his mother cleaned office buildings at night. Nothing shameful, nothing special. The origin most people have. But Wallace grew up with an obsession. The obsession with what he called looking like something. From young, he had learned that perception was worth more than reality. That if you dressed right, spoke right, moved in the right circles, most people assumed you belonged. And once they assumed it, they treated you like you did. And when people treat you like you belong somewhere, doors open. And when doors open, you get things you couldn't get any other way. It wasn't love. It wasn't honest work. It was the systematic exploitation of the human tendency to confuse appearance with reality. Cassie was raised in that system, not because she was born bad. That's the hardest part to swallow honestly. She learned from her parents that people divide into 2 groups, those who have and those who don't, and that the work of life is to move from the second group to the first, by whatever means are available. Marriage was one of those means. It always had been. This doesn't diminish what they did. The injustice Wallace felt about not being born wealthy didn't give him the right to create injustice for others. The justification doesn't exist in any version of this. But understanding where it came from helps understand why there were others before us. Why there was a pattern. Why Candace wasn't the first, and we wouldn't have been the last. It's the kind of thing that thrives in darkness and withers in the light. Kendana Nadfaredwet. I want to talk about one specific moment from the night of the engagement dinner that I haven't described yet. After Malcolm had led me to the table with his colleagues, after the initial crisis passed and I'd sat down and breathed and started functioning again, there was a moment near the end of the dinner when I went to find the restroom. In the corridor, I passed Wallace Sterling coming back from the same direction. He was alone, and when he saw me, he produced that smile, the one I knew by then, which didn't reach his eyes, which assessed, which measured. "Mr. Davis," he said, with the tone of a man being generous by acknowledging someone's existence at all. "So glad you could make it." "Glad to be here," I replied, with the neutrality of someone who isn't going to give the other person the satisfaction of a real reaction. He moved on. I continued to the restroom. But what stayed with me was this. In that moment, with everything I already knew from the recordings Malcolm had played in the car, I looked at this man and saw someone who felt completely safe, who believed the plan was working, who had calculated that I was exactly what his daughter had said I was. Too trusting, too simple, too connected to a son who would ultimately do whatever love asked of him. And I said nothing. I held everything inside my chest and walked back to the table. There's a particular feeling in knowing something you can't yet say. It sits in you like a hot coal you have to hold in your mouth. You can't let it fall, can't spit it out. You just hold it and wait. But as the evening went on, that hot coal changed into something else. Not serenity, something older and more deliberate. The patience that only exists when you know exactly what you're waiting for. Let me say a word about the day before the wedding, the morning of the planning session with Ty Jackson. After we worked through the technical presentation, after Ty had shown us the precise timing of each file, after every contingency had been addressed, there was a moment when the three of us sat at Malcolm's kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while. Malcolm had a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Ty was reviewing something on his laptop. I was looking out the window at the Atlanta street below. Ordinary midday traffic. Ordinary people. A world that had no idea what was happening in that apartment. And Malcolm said quietly, almost to himself, "Pop, do you think Mama would understand why I'm doing this the way I'm doing it? The public part, the making it a scene part." I thought about Sarah for a moment, about how she approached hard situations. She was a direct woman, Sarah. Not cruel, never cruel. But she believed that if something was wrong, it deserved to be said plainly, not whispered about in corners. I said, she'd say that the only place to expose a lie is in the light, and that a wedding was always going to be in the light. Malcolm nodded. He picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything else. But something settled in him, I could see. Some last remaining uncertainty about the rightness of the approach resolved itself in that quiet. And when we walked into that ballroom, when the screen lit up and the first recording began to play, there was nothing hesitant about my son. He stood at that altar with the clarity of a man who has thought about something completely, decided, and is now simply executing. I have never been more proud of him. There is something I want to say for whoever is listening to this, who recognizes something in it. Not necessarily the same story, but the same feeling. The knot in the stomach. The discomfort you can't name. The internal voice saying this isn't right while your reason is trying to explain why it has to be right. Don't silence that voice. You don't have to act on impulse. Malcolm didn't. He waited, gathered evidence, thought, planned. But he didn't dismiss what he was feeling just because he didn't have proof yet. He didn't override his instinct just because love was telling him to. He kept his eyes open while his heart stayed hopeful. It is possible to do both at the same time. To love someone and keep your eyes open. To trust the relationship and pay attention to the contradictions. To be loyal and be watchful. They aren't opposites. They're the two sides of the same wisdom. The farm taught me that better than anything else. You plant with hope, but you tend the crop with attention. You can't just plant and walk away and expect everything to come out right on its own. You have to be there, looking, adjusting, protecting when you need to. Life isn't different. If this story stayed with you, if something in it resonated, if it made you think about what's worth protecting in your own life, Show it by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I read every one of them. Until the next story. One more thing about the months of trial and the time between. Malcolm stayed at the farm with me for almost a full year before returning to any kind of regular life in the city. During that time, we worked together every day. And it was in that period I came to understand things about my son that 18 months of weekend visits hadn't shown me. I understood that he was a man who processed things in silence, that he didn't talk about pain until he was ready, that he carried the weight of what happened into the physical work, literally into the land. There were days when he worked past dark without stopping, with that kind of driven physical energy that speaks a language a man uses when something inside won't fit anymore and needs somewhere to go. And there were days when he'd stop in the middle of a task, hands on a fence post or an arm resting on the tractor wheel, and look out at the horizon for a while. I let him. Didn't ask. Knew that when he had words, he'd use them. One evening in late spring, sitting on the porch after a long day clearing the south field, he said, "You know what the worst part is, Pop? It's not that she lied to me. It's that I helped her. I handed her the passwords. I took her to meet you. I brought her into everything we have. And she was calculating the whole time how to take it apart. That's not on you, son. It feels like it is. You trusted someone who was specifically designed to be trusted. The Sterlings didn't do any of this sloppily. They practiced. They refined it on other people before they got to you. You weren't naive. You were deceived by professionals." He was quiet for a while. "Do you think I'll trust someone like that again?" "Not like that. You're going to trust differently now. Not less. Differently. You know things now that protect you. That's not cynicism. That's wisdom." The Georgia evening was doing what Georgia evenings do in late spring. Cooling slowly, the fireflies, starting at the field edge, the sound of the creek down the hill. "I've been thinking about staying," Malcolm said. "Here?" "Here, on the farm, permanently." I looked at him carefully. "That's a big decision." "I know. I've been thinking it for a while. This last year reminded me what matters. The land, family, work that means something. In the city, I was running a life that wasn't mine, trying to impress people who weren't worth the effort. Is any of this about Cassie? About not wanting to go back to the world where that happened?" He thought about it honestly. "Some of it might be, but not most of it. Most of it is just, this is where I want to be." I looked at the field going dark in the late light. "Nothing would make me happier," I said. But I needed to ask. He stayed. And he was right about why. And the farm is better for it. There is a moment from the trial that I didn't describe, and it belongs here. On the second day, during a recess, I was standing in the courthouse corridor when I saw Cassie being walked past by her attorney and a court officer. She didn't look at me, but for a fraction of a second, just a moment in the space of a doorway, I saw her face without the practiced expression, without the victimhood she'd been performing, without the calculation, without the performance at all. Just a face. Young, actually. Younger than I remembered her looking. I don't know what was moving across that face. Regret? Fear? Something simpler than either. Just the experience of consequences arriving, which no one ever fully anticipates, no matter how thoroughly they've thought about it. I looked away first. I have thought about that fraction of a second many times since. Not because it changed how I understood what she had done, but because it reminded me that even people who do terrible things are still people. That the capacity to do something cruel doesn't make someone entirely other than human. It just makes them someone who made terrible choices and is now living with what those choices produced. I don't forgive the Sterlings for what they tried to do. That's not what this is about. But I hold that hallway moment lightly as a reminder that justice isn't the same as hatred. That you can pursue the truth relentlessly without needing the people on the other side of it to be monsters. They were just people. Flawed, selfish, calculating, destructive people. But people. The law made its accounting. That's what it's there for. Today, at 69, I sit on this porch and watch the Georgia evening arrive the way it has arrived here for as long as there have been people on this land to watch it. The pines along the fence line, the sound of the creek, the particular orange that Georgia skies produce just before the light goes. Malcolm's truck is in the yard, his wife's car beside it. The lights are on in the kitchen. I can hear them moving around in there, probably starting dinner, probably talking about their day in that easy way of people who are comfortable with each other. My granddaughter from Nia's family is visiting this weekend. She's 4. She has Sarah's eyes. Same shape, same color, same quality of attention in them. When she looks at something, she really looks. This is what the Sterlings were trying to take, not just the land. All of this, the evening, the truck in the yard, the lights in the kitchen, the child with her grandmother's eyes. They thought they were acquiring real estate. They didn't understand that land isn't separate from the life lived on it, that you can't take one without attempting to destroy the other. Malcolm understood that, even when he was barely awake to the threat. That's why he fought the way he fought. Not for abstract justice, for the porch and the pines and the kitchen light and everything, those things hold. And he won. We won. Not because we were smarter than the Sterlings, not because we were richer or better connected or had more resources. We won because we had the truth, and because Malcolm had the courage to use it at the right moment in the right place. That's the whole story. The truth, used at the right moment in the right place, by someone with the courage to use it. It doesn't always work out this way, I know that. There are families who faced versions of this and lost. There are honest people who've been defrauded by people like Wallace Sterling and never got their accounting. The world isn't perfectly just. But sometimes it is. And this was one of those times, and I'm grateful. Not for what happened to the Sterlings. That's for the law and whatever else weighs these things to account for. I'm grateful that my son is here, that the farm is here, that there are lights on in the kitchen and a little girl with her grandmother's eyes in the yard. Grateful. That's the word. That's where I'll end. If this story mattered to you in any way, leave a like, subscribe if you want to hear more. I share new stories regularly, and leave a comment. Tell me what city you're in. Tell me if any of this resonated with something in your own life. I'll be here. Until next time.